January is a great month to refine our winter botany skills by learning to recognize important dormant season plant characteristics such as bark, buds, and persistent flower and fruit structures. Our talk tonight will cover tips on how to recognize a variety of native and invasive plants using these characteristics. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker on this topic tonight, Nancy Slowik. Nancy has been teaching natural history programs and leading guided walks in the metropolitan area for more than 40 years, and is the author of 2 field guides on local flora for the Palisades. She began teaching for the New York Botanical Garden in 2012 as an adult education instructor and now serves as the coordinator of the Urban Naturalist program. She currently serves as a native plant consultant for restorenativeplant.org, where she provides guidance for plant propagation and restoration projects in Ramapo Mountain State Park. Formerly director of Greenbrook Sanctuary, a 165-acre nature preserve in the New Jersey Palisades, she was previously the co-founder of the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, the first native plant propagation program for the New York City Parks Department. Please feel free to enter any questions or comments into the chat during the talk. And at the conclusion, we will go through as many questions as we are able. Also, if you are unable to stay for the whole talk or would like to be able to share this with others, a recording will be posted on our YouTube page where you can also find recordings of other recent talks. And that I'm also going to link into the chat. So now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nancy. Thank you. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Unmute. Yeah, that's all right. I was unmuted before. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I am currently teaching this class. It's a lot warmer inside than it was this past week. So I'm enjoying the indoor temperatures, although they seem to be going up a bit outside. I have included a brief bio of my earlier days because I realized, as I said to Lydia, I cannot contribute. I no longer live in the metropolitan area, but I had formerly lived on Staten Island. So I think it's a great project, and we just talked about that. I had all these things to contribute, and then I realized, nope, can't do that. All right, so without further ado, I'm gonna share my screen and start. All right. You should be seeing a large milkweed explosion. Milkweed did very well this year. So, whoops, sorry, let me go back. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. All right. One of my students was unable to attend our class, which is currently going on right now. And it's 12 hours of both indoor and outdoor learning. Last year with the pandemic, we actually did a blended class. It was very cold. We were out for 2 hours at a time. And I decided to bring it back in the classroom this year. But Bethany was down in Virginia, and she sent me these lovely photos. And to me, that is just a beckoning to get outside and explore your winter wonderland. Of course, the southern part got a lot more snow than we did. This program is sort of a highlight of what I do for 12 hours with winter botany. And it's something I've been teaching outdoors for years, since I was early naturalist days. So I'm very familiar with it, and I'm much more of a field outdoor teacher than I am an indoor teacher, but here we go. Brief retrospective, I am a 4th generation Staten Islander, believe it or not. My great grandparents and grandparents on my mother's side settled there and had a German bakery, both generations. A lot of times people really just see Staten Island as a place to pass through, but it's really a remarkable area. I grew up on the North Shore. It's a large island, 17 miles long by 7 miles wide at the widest point, and lived in Clay Pit State Park, which was a newly formed park in the 80s for 10 years. What was so amazing was a Greenbelt was formed in 1985, and it was a huge battle. It was a 25-year plus battle trying to save that green central portion, just a beautiful area that would have been divided by a road. And it was an amazing accomplishment. At that time, we were seeing so much development with it just never seemed to end. And we approached the New York City parks and proposed the Greenbelt Native Plant Center. And during that period, I worked with my co-founder, Richard Lynch, and we followed the field notes of Nathaniel Lord Britton. And I thought this was appropriate, seeing that he was the founder of the New York Botanical Garden. He had taken amazing notes, and we followed his early flora and went back to places where he had noted special plants. He had a summer home on Staten Island, so I guess he spent his summers exploring. I left there and went up to the New Jersey Palisades, and my office was on top of one of those amazing ridges. It was very primitive, and I spent the next 20 years literally walking up and down those Palisades. It kept me in good shape, but I'm glad to be retired from there now. It was always difficult in the snow and the ice. It was an amazing area. So I have my foothold and my best memories back in Staten Island in those early days of finding lots of different plants. Today, I'll talk a little bit about some of these life-changing books that came in publication in the 70s. And Weeds in Winter was one of them. And Lauren Brown taught the class at New York Botanical Garden, because I also was a student in the adult education department at the New York Botanical Garden. And I took her class, and she was unbelievable. Her book is still in publication, and she has a couple of other books. But her Weeds in Winter really was groundbreaking, as was Donald Stokes. And we also used today the Woody Plants in Winter by Core and Ammons. In '95, Carol Levine published her really unbelievable book, Wildflowers in Winter. She taught this class at the New York Botanical Garden for many, many years. And I'm so sad to hear of her passing, her recent passing. We continue to use her book, and I encourage you, if you don't have a copy, please, it's just remarkable. She has an illustrated key. I don't have a picture of it. I am a big believer in dichotomous keys. I think they can be incredibly helpful. Students are often terrified of them, and I force them to open the book, crack the book, and I bring in all kinds of plants for them to practice in the classroom. So part of this program, as Lydia mentioned, we'll be looking at the skeletal remains of herbaceous plants, which is what my focus is on that first 3 hours. I know it's not really in the program title, we kind of added it, but it's a really important part. And what I love about it is that you really can see these skeletal structures. Okay, there we go. They're actually more obvious in many plants in winter, and it's a good place to hone your skills and botanical terminology. So here, if you're defining an umbel, which are flowers that are born from a central or common point, you can't illustrate it any better than this dried skeletal remain. And one of my students, I thought it was really interesting. She said, you know, that sounds almost human. And in a way, it's a way of humanizing plants. I mean, bringing them to life, because it is difficult sometimes to cross that boundary. So we devote a large portion of the 12 hours to identifying the winter weeds. This is goutweed. Goutweed is a horrible invasive. It's found often on these rocky, shady outcrops, and I've been battling it for years in my backyard. I currently live on the north side of High Tor, which is part of the New York Palisades in Rockland County. We go through many of the different definitions, and I've selected one today for you for the dehiscent fruits. These are the fruits that dry and open and release their seeds when they're ripe. And I'm particularly fond of the group that produces what's called a follicle. This is a one chamber splitting along one suture, medical term, or seam. And milkweeds are the best known representative of that particular family that produces it. That used to be the milkweed family. It's now the dogbane family. And they do have this one, let me get my pointer, one seam that from a packaging design format, these are so well packaged. They have an insulated liner, and the seeds are all just packaged in this beautiful format. It's a great plant. So you learn that, and all of a sudden you see other ones, and you're able to identify other species with that particular follicle. So here's a good example of swamp milkweed, which is a much thinner follicle. Fewer seeds are found inside, but it's a similar packaging. One of my favorites, and I don't have a winter photo of it, is the four-leaf milkweed. It's a very uncommon milkweed that blooms extremely early. Most folks are looking for milkweeds in bloom in the summer. This one blooms in May. And it's just a beautiful plant with a very thin follicle that grows in these rocky outcrops in the New Jersey Palisades, as well as the Ramapo Mountains. One of the tiniest ones is the world milkweed. Asclepias verticillata is a very, very small follicle. Again, a rocky outcrop. I guess I'm doomed to be on the rocky outcrops, walking up and down the rocks. Here's one that you do want to pay attention to. It is an invasive, and I have watched this plant literally swallow up habitats and destroy the biodiversity, particularly on Hook Mountain. I led walks for the Tory Club for over 10 years, and they were largely on Hook Mountain, a wonderful diversity of herbaceous plants. Unfortunately, this member, the swallow wart, is from Europe, and it has no enemies whatsoever, and it has just literally taken over. You want to learn to recognize it. It's very difficult to control, and they are working on it. I was actually at one point working with an entomologist who was looking for biological controls. We also look at fleshy fruits, and I've selected one, the berry, which is one of my favorites, although drupes are right behind. And this one is the horse nettle. This is clearly an earlier season, but these fruits that look like mini tomatoes and with stripes, let me just see if I can, sometimes I can put my magnifying glass, but it's not letting me today. Let me try this again. Nope. These little mini tomatoes will ripen into sort of an orangey color in the winter, and the leaves are gone, but they sort of jump out at you. And they look, if you were to open them, they look like a small tomato in the Solanaceae family. I have to tell you, I one day was looking out my office window and there was a gentleman who was sort of squeezing them. And all of a sudden he squeezed them and it shot into his eye. And he was then jumping around the parking lot. What he'd done is he'd dilated his pupils because of the family that it's in. Women would do that in the early 1900s to look more alluring. So I helped him clear out his eyes with some water, but it was very traumatic. This is an example of one of the final projects for one of the students from last year. And because we were out in the field, I allowed them to just photograph plants, but they had the option to create a field guide and mount these specimens in a notebook. And one of my students, Amanda Birnbaum, who has given me permission to share her final project, selected the more traditional field book, and then she photographed it. And I just loved this one. She was embarrassed about it because she thought it was messy, but I love it. She's got her habitat. We talk about the habitats, the fruits. Here are the berries, glossy, flattened seeds, field characteristics. She even added some notes. And the specimen has an unpleasant odor like ginkgo fruits. So she really went all out on this project and did a great job. This program is being taught on Friday, and last Friday, even though it was a little bit warmer, it was extremely windy. And so we were kind of on the ground, so to speak, and we found we were looking for a different Basil rosette, but Basil rosettes are sort of these placeholders that stay green for most of the winter and can help you identify plants in winter. This one belongs to the genus Avens. It is a geum, and I believe it is probably Canadense, although we weren't able to absolutely identify it. We were looking for this one. This is a very common urban native plant that belongs to, it's a biennial by the name of evening primrose. And it starts out its first year as a Basil rosette. Here it is. And will the following year turn into these long, tall stalks, I should say, with bright yellow flowers that bloom and eventually form this four-parted chamber. They just survive in some of the most difficult areas. And it is an interesting plant. One of my students called it the happy hour plant because in the summer, it opens its flowers in the late afternoon, about 4 o'clock, and blooms into the evening. We look for field characteristics like odor, and certainly many of these herbaceous plants have really significant smells. If you've hiked around the Palisades or in Inwood Hill, you might come across this pennyroyal, which is a very insignificant looking plant. But if you crush it, it is incredibly pungent and belongs to the mint family. You can see that clearly opposite branching, prominent calyx, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Habitat, I'm a big believer in looking at where are you looking at the plant, what's the address, is it growing in a woodland, a field, a wetland, a roadside? And one of the places that I always went to in the winter was a high coastal dune on Staten Island at Crooks Point. And if you know the address, you almost know what plants to expect, like seaside goldenrod and beach grass, and this Spartina that was very uncommon grew there as well, the freshwater cordgrass, Spartina pectinata. So it's knowing the address can help you, if knowing the habitat can help you identify many of the plants. I'm a big believer in learning family characteristics. It will be your best friend in botany. And I really encourage my students to learn 6 of the common families. We'll just look at this one. Obviously, I don't have 12 hours. I have one. And you can see that it is in the mint family. But what's obvious is once the flowers, the petals fall away, the calyx that holds those petals becomes incredibly obvious. And Carol Levine's book has such an amazing treatment of how to identify the species mints in this family by their calyxes. And it's beautifully illustrated by Dick Rao. You can really identify many of these plants looking at that. This is a very small plant. It's now being questioned whether or not it is a native, but for now, I keep it in my native category. Again, the mint families, opposite branching, square stems, obvious calyx. So these are characteristics that when you're out in the field are readily available to you. Well, a lot of my students, they get in the class and half of them are like, oh, all right, we're going to do herbaceous plants, and they don't want to do them. They want to move immediately to the trees. And I get it. They're big and they're bold. And bark is always one of their favorites. And I love bark. I think bark is, it really stands out in the woodland in the winter. It's just so obvious. But I encourage people, if they're making a positive ID, that you may want additional information. Now, there are many people who say, oh, I know the bark. It doesn't hurt to just take a minute and look on the ground or look above and see if you can find additional information. So here's bark of a really common upland forest, winter woodland forest, the chestnut oak, Quercus montana. And it's got very furrowed bark. It's really classically furrowed. This is another previous. But I encourage people to look on the ground. And the acorns of this particular oak, when they fall to the ground, they immediately put out a rootlet and hook themselves in the ground and start growing. And they stay there for that winter. And you can easily find them. So it's just one more clue to look for when you're identifying something. They always lose their cap. It's rare that you find a chestnut oak acorn that falls to the ground with its cap on. And they're large. They're beautiful, beautiful, almost look like peanut M&Ms. Great, great looking acorn. One of the other common trees that you'll notice is the northern red oak. Here's one that was toppled in a nor'easter, and you can really see the white stripes that go up and down the bark. I learned it as looking for ski slopes on an oak. It's fairly easy, but doesn't hurt you to look below and see if you can't find one of its acorns. Now, red oak acorns are filled with tannins, and they're slightly less desirable, and there's usually some hanging around, but I encourage you to take a look for them. This is a tree species that I always try to look for, and it is often overlooked. The scarlet oak, because it can be confused with a red oak. You can see the upper bark has these white striations, but they're more variable. They're not as regularly patterned. And younger scarlet oaks look even more different. So keep in mind, if you're looking at a young tree, the bark may look completely different from an older tree. There are lots of variations. I really encourage looking for the acorns. And when we're at the garden, which is really manicured very nicely, we look like a bunch of squirrels out there looking for acorns. But here's one that we usually can find. And one of the ways to ID the scarlet oak acorn is these etched concentric circles at the bottom of the nut. It's very clear, and it helps, just another key to help you ID. Of course, the white oak is very common. It's a pale gray bark that starts to exfoliate as it matures. But I challenge you to find an acorn. It's the #1 food on most wildlife lists. And usually you can just find some of their warty caps or leaves. There are quite a few of the bitternut hickories in the garden, and we come across any number of them. They have, particularly near the Thane family forest, they have this beautiful lattice-like bark. It looks like lace to me. But if you want to confirm it, and of course this is a fall picture, but you can find their distinctly ridged nuts that are in conjunction with their bright sulfur winter buds will help you confirm that bark. So I'm always looking for another clue. Shagbark hickory, hard to make a mistake. There's not much that doesn't exfoliate like this. It's just peeling off, and a beautiful slow growing tree. It takes a long time for these to mature. Huge, huge fruits. You probably won't find the nut, but you may find one of these large husks that are tossed aside by the wildlife. This is one that I have trouble with. We live in an area that has quite a few black walnut. Beautiful tree, handsome tree, but the bark can be a little tricky. This is an older specimen. And so I'm always looking for evidence that it is a black walnut. Now, obviously, when it has leaves, it's a lot easier, but you can often find the remnants of these enormous fruits that if you handle them too much, you will have stained your hands because it is something that was used traditionally as a black dye. And so you don't want to handle them all that much. And then we're just zooming in at the end. I can't ever teach the class without going to visit the persimmon tree at the garden, the Diospyros virginiana. The bark is deeply divided into these square plates. And there's a wonderful colony of them in Bucks Hollow, in the Greenbelt in Staten Island, where we would go in those early days to collect the fruits. And we grew in the Greenbelt Native Plant Center persimmon trees from those fruits. They were difficult to get going. They have to go through, I believe, a gut of an animal. So we had to scarify them in order to get them to germinate. I also pay attention to lesser known trees. I guess because I'm short myself, I like to look at the understory. The understory is really diverse. And one of the trees of the understory that often gets overlooked is the American basswood. It has rather a smooth, but almost diamond-shaped bark that is fairly common in rocky upland woods. It was a preferred tree of carvers, and the indigenous people used this tree to carve their masks. It's a remarkable tree, but it can be difficult to pick it out from the crowd. So you'd want to look for remnants of its fruits, which are very distinctive with this. Here are the fruits, and it has this little flying attachment. Also look for the red buds that are very distinctive in winter. So here you can see a few of them. Handsome tree. This one, I don't think anybody ever knows this tree. When I take everyone out into the field, into the thane forest, I really try to target this one, hop hornbeam, another understory tree with this very thin peeling bark. It never gets to be very large diameter, but it's just beautiful. And occasionally you can find the lingering fruits in the understory. So these are some less common or perhaps overlooked that you might want to check out. I've added just two really recognizable wetland trees for their exfoliating bark. There's nothing more beautiful than the sycamores and their creamy colored, pale cream under bark, as well as the river birch. We used to do a lot of canoe trips, and this was a plant that you always saw along the river edge. Very handsome. And Amanda, when she did her final project, because part of it is to select 3 trees, a shrub, and a herbaceous plant, she selected the river birch. And I thought she did another amazing job at pointing out the field characteristics, the buds and the catkins, its growth habits. She really, really looked at these plants. So it's a wonderful study in learning how to identify them. Sadly, you can use the bark to locate this horrific emerald ash borer disease that is literally decimating our native ashes. And it produces these patchy, blotchy, white areas, which signify that this tree is no longer alive. The insects have gotten under the cambium layer, and they've just sucked the life out of the tree. So bark can be helpful when you're trying to locate them. I had to throw this in. If you've got your binoculars, you just never know what you're going to find living in a tree. I was leading a winter tree walk on the Palisades, and we were lucky enough to see these little guys poking their heads out of a very large tulip tree that had been struck by lightning. They often get damaged in lightning storms, but it was still alive. And Mom was right there watching over her owlets. So winter has all kinds of perks and surprises going out in the cold. You never know what you're going to find. Stay away from this one. Poison ivy, very recognizable in their aerial roots in the winter. And this one looks like a fur coat. You can get contact dermatitis from winter touching, but not as significant as in the summer. You also can pick out where the oriental bittersweet is growing. And my goodness, it's just beyond belief how incredible it can grow upon itself and twine and literally scale these large trees and constrict them in a way that is really hard to imagine that anything can survive. This is one we rescued, and it was alive. It just was completely deformed and not doing all that well. Of course, it would have these beautiful berries that are gorgeous and very ornamental, but something to look for. There is an American bittersweet, but it's been years since I've seen it anywhere. So assume that you've got Oriental. Which brings us to berries as part of the title. And in the winter, berries are hard to find. Most of them have been consumed by wildlife, or they've ripened and they've fallen. They really start to fall apart. This is one I found at the garden, high bush cranberry. They seem to linger for quite some time. And of course, there's always some birds hanging out somewhere around, but they're pretty desiccated and they're not as gorgeous as they were 2 months ago. Here's one that is another early fruit, Viburnum prunifolium, black haw, a common shrub along, or once common shrub along the New Jersey, New York Palisades ridge line. And they do become rather desiccated, but you can find them in the winter. They're just a little bit more dark in color. Once the leaves are gone from the Virginia creeper, I didn't have a photo of that. The blue fruits just are really an important winter wildlife food for the Virginia creeper, or woodbine, which is a vine, Parthenocissus, quinquefolia for its 5-parted leaf. Very handsome looking vine. It can be a little aggressive, but it has its good points, and it is native. One of my favorites to find in the winter is the winterberry, the Ilex verticillata. It's a deciduous holly found growing in wetlands. Once the leaves are gone, it's really stunning. This is a photo taken by Alan Wells. I volunteer with him in a project that he's been championing in Harriman State Park, where he's been logging the insects and birds. He's asked me to do a flora list for him, and they're really stunning. Lots of wildlife feed on them, and they seem to last a good portion of the winter. So I see them in the woodland, in the wetland, so you might look for them. Sumac, always a welcome sight. They seem to last longer than any of the other fruits. And I think when winter is tough, the birds eventually resort to these hairy fruits. This is smooth sumac. The more common one's staghorn, but I like this more diminutive little sumac that grows in dry areas. I'm sure you all recognize Japanese honeysuckle. And here are the fruits. They're quite attractive. The birds do eat them. I don't know about other wildlife. It is an invasive, considered an invasive vine. Not as invasive as Oriental bittersweet. It is tardily deciduous, so the leaves will hold on through a good portion of the winter. And they provide habitat for a lot of different animals. Perhaps I have lots of favorites, but this one is right up there, the wintergreen, or sometimes called checkerberry, Gaultheria procumbens. It's a low-growing plant that you really have to kind of look for. This one was taken in, I took this photo in Lily Pond. There's a beautiful little population of it that grows close to the ground. And of course, poison ivy fruits. If someone brings you white berries, give them back, because those are also, can give you a rash. All right, my last offering, and I didn't include as much of this, but the winter buds are tricky, and we do a lot of indoor and outdoor. So we look at things when your hands aren't shaking indoors. I bring in specimens, but they can be difficult to find and identify. This is a fairly common and very recognizable winter bud that belongs to the red maple. It's true to its name. It has these opposite branching, and often you can, their branches are low enough for you to see them. So many of the trees are so tall, or the lower limbs have been trimmed or broken, that you can't really reach the buds. We discuss the different terms that the dichotomous keys bring you through, and you need to learn them in order to follow the dichotomous key. The terminal bud, that bud at the very end, that will be next year's growth. The lateral or the side buds, these beautiful leaf scars that almost look like faces, and the bundle scars where the vascular tissue was attached at one time before the abscission layer sealed it off. And then, of course, the bud scale scars, which from here to here would indicate that that was the 1 year of growth. That terminal bud had been located at this base. So we look for all of those features when we go out into the woods, and almost ad nauseum look at whether things are branched opposite. And that can be tricky because nature is full of, all of these imperfections. And so you'll see damage has caused some of these branches to break off, but a preponderance of opposite branching or alternate. And so here you have the branches predominantly alternate. Whoops. And with opposite branching, you have limited choices of native trees, which makes it easier. So we start with the opposite branching. And the mnemonic, which I think everybody knows, can be helpful to locate the maple, ash, dogwood, and honeysuckle family, as well as horse chestnut. Ashes are getting harder to find, and just the younger trees are surviving. Here's a good example of the flower buds of flowering dogwood. So the flower buds are much larger than the leaf buds. So there's some differences there. Here we have alternate branching of the northern red oak, and oaks have this really unique terminal bud that with clusters, and just seeing that, you've got an oak in hand. Getting it to species is a different story, but at least you've got quercus. Some of the buds are what we refer to as pseudo-terminal. They are not directly at the end of this twig. Elms are a good example of that. They grow in this zigzag sort of pattern because of that pseudo-terminal bud. And I apologize that no matter what I do, I never quite get a good picture of it. I've got two. I actually resorted to growing a butternut because I could never find one in the woods. Here is the bud scar of what looks to be sort of a face, a little goat or a little sheep. And here's another one. And let me see if I can get I'm going to turn this one off. Okay. And let me get my magnifier. There we go. You can see it almost looks like it has a little nose. Although this plant is getting so big, soon I will not be able to reach it. So beautiful, beautiful faces in these winter buds. Some of them have very small, vascular bundles and leaf scars, but lots of scales that cover the bud. So each one is unique. And sometimes you just don't recognize them. Here's one that we grew from seed. It's become fairly rare and in the wild, called strawberry shrub. It's a native euonymus. And how stunning is that? Look at those colors, red and green, very handsome euonymus. So if you don't see it in the guidebook, it's either probably ornamental or rare. So lots to look at. If you can invest in a 10 power hand lens or loop and pair of binoculars, camera or cell phone, get your waterproof boots, critical, hat, gloves. I encourage you to go out there and explore your metro flora, because there's lots of it out there in Van Cortlandt Park, Pelham Bay, Inwood Hill, Greenbelt on Staten Island. For anybody out there that's a Staten Islander, I'll put a plug in. A few websites that I use, I largely rely on the New York Flora website. I often use the USDA, but they seem to be not as up to date as the others. And certainly Go Botany is a really good link. And I know you all use apps and of course the iNaturalist that you use to document what you're finding in the woods. And apparently there's Seek. I don't know if you use that one. It's similar to iNaturalist, uses the power of image recognition. So those are all ways to kind of get into those identifications. I want to thank you very much. I know I went through a lot of information, but I did want to leave some time for questions. And these are just some of the references. I probably have omitted a few of them, so my apologies for that, but I tried to list them as we went along. So I'm going to stop my share and see how Lydia's doing. I see Lydia up in the corner. She's still awake. I see her. All right. So I'll let you share the chat box. I'm going to take a drink of tea.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nancy. I know that some of those, are things that I'm familiar with seeing in the other seasons, that it's to kind of look at them from that perspective will be very helpful out in the field.
Great.
I did link some of the guides that you mentioned in the beginning, the three books. If anyone's interested. I know I actually was lucky enough to come across a guide to nature in winter at a thrift store a couple of years ago, and that was a really cheap score. And I would also say I recommend the Go Botany website, which is really great also for kind of an introduction to the dichotomous keys, because they'll have you can hover over different terminology and it will tell you what that is. Sometimes it will give an illustration. And it's easy to jump back and forth because sometimes with those dichotomous keys, you realize that you've gone down perhaps the wrong path. So to kind of backtrack to a point that you were more confident in, it's easy to do on there. Would you be able to share, to put back up the last slide just so that people could write down some of those
absolutely.
resources?
Sure. Absolutely. So let me just, okay, let me share my screen. Okay, let me just go down to the, hold on. Of course, there you go.
And again, those 3 books that were in the beginning, I have
okay.
Those a little bit earlier in the chat.
Yeah, so sometimes I do refer back to Newcomb's, and in order to be current, Steve Young has a link with updates for the botanical names. And so I've included that as well. If you're a Newcomb's, I'm kind of old fashioned in that sense. You have to remember that when I first got started, there were no cell phones, there were no personal computers. Field guides were really what you relied on, and Tory Club walks. That was how you learned your botany in the field. And I'm reading a book now that talks about what it was like in the 30s and 20s, 1920s. The birder clubs used to buy books and cut them up and bring color plates into the field of these different birds. I mean, you have to kind of realize how difficult it was in the field to recognize things without taking photos or collecting. So it's just, I don't know. I don't know what I do without a cell phone. That's today.
Yeah, technology has been a huge, huge help for a lot of stuff. All right, so we've got a couple questions.
Okay. Should I stop my share or keep it up?
It looks like if you could go up maybe to one of the other slides that had the apps. People were also
of course. Yep. Mm-hmm. So these were, I'd actually been reviewing these. I had to give a program for New Jersey Native Plant Society, and they had asked me to review some of the apps. And these were 2 that Seek was one that they found to be very helpful. iNaturalist, obviously you use that. But then these were reviewed and they were all free. And PlantNet, LeafSnap, PlantSnap, Seek, and iNaturalist were some of the top 5 that came up in that. So if that helps you in any way, I didn't want to go too much into apps because it seemed a little out of my purview. But and then these were the links that we talked about, and I am a big user of Go Botany. When in my early days at the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, we were very much in contact with Garden in the Woods in Framingham, and we actually had a lot of contact with them because there weren't many native plant propagation facilities around in the mid 80s. And they were one that had been in business for 100 years. So they really were ahead of the game. They have since put this wonderful website up. And I agree, Lydia, the dichotomous keys are just really easy to use.
All right. And so I will just say a note on the difference between Seek and iNaturalist. As far as I can tell, they're pretty much, they're very similar. The difference is that Seek doesn't post your observations kind of to the iNaturalist overall thing. So if you're concerned with privacy, or I know a lot of times for younger students, if they want to be able to kind of use this, that's a kind of an easier one for them to use, but it does get utilized then that the AI and all that kind of database that they have.
Okay.
All right, we've got a couple questions about ash trees. Devin asks, I have a couple young ash trees in my yard. Should I bother to let them grow, or should I take them down and plant something less likely to be invaded? I'd hate to see anything down that has managed to seed itself.
Great question. And I literally sat in a conference about this EAB, the emerald ash borer. So the young ash trees are not affected by emerald ash borer until they get to be of a diameter of about 4 inches. And beyond that, they become more susceptible. That said, they are looking for resistant ash trees, and they're finding a few of them. And there's a whole project set up. The woman is in Ohio, but there's a counterpart in one of the state universities, and I'd have to look it up, I don't recall offhand, where they are documenting any ash trees that are over 4 inches in diameter that are unaffected by emerald ash borer. They're tracking them. And their feeling is that there's always survivors, just like with the chestnut trees, just like the eastern hemlock, there are always survivors, and they're trying to get them into propagation if they're documented as a survivor. So I would not cut them down. I would not. They're asking you not to cut them, although the Parks Department is cutting them right now. If they're dead, if they're already dead, they're cutting them down. But if they're unsure about their viability, they're asking you, please don't do that. Please monitor it and get in touch with them. I hope that, Devin, hi Devin, I hope that answers your question.
Great. All right. Actually, so in the kind of theme of that of emerald ash borer, Georgia says that you mentioned changes in the forest, such as ash decline due to emerald ash borer. Are there any other changes that you've noticed in the forest canopy?
Ooh. Oh, well, for me, the biggest change in my lifetime would have been the hemlock loss. I worked in an area that had a large eastern hemlock population, and it was heartbreaking to see them succumb to woolly adelgid and there are other problems with it other than the woolly adelgid. So for me, I literally documented when I was at Greenbrook, not just the loss of that tree, but all of the animals and that were connected to it. So we lost our ruffed grouse, we lost our broadwing hawk that nested in them. Our red squirrel was gone very quickly as those trees declined. Now that said, other things came in, but it was a huge loss. It was really a keystone species, which some people argue about that term, but in my estimation, it was a keystone species that really changed the forest. They were cool in the summer. They were shady. It was a huge loss. The woodpeckers did very well. The woodpeckers would go into those dead trees, but that was a big loss. So that would be one that I found to be an overwhelming, sad, and very fast. These things happen very quickly.
Another question we have from Jack. He says in Tallien's book on oaks, he talks about the presence of caterpillars through winter, which birds feed on. He says he hasn't encountered any of them, but he wonders if you have witnessed this.
So, oh gosh, dating myself here. So about 20 plus years ago, we had a researcher come into the sanctuary, because Greenbrook Sanctuary was not just a teaching facility, but it was also a research field station. And he set up an experiment in the canopy. And the board allowed him to scale these tulip trees. And I remember saying to him, I know the tulip trees are easier to climb because they're straight, but it's really the oaks that you want to go to. And he didn't listen to me. He was putting out insect traps, sticky traps, and he had pulley systems, and he'd pull them down, and he almost got no insects. They were all in the oak trees, and so they're up in the canopy. You're not seeing them unless you've got tree climbing equipment, or or you're arboreal yourself. They're up in the canopy. I think that's the reason. And it was a painful lesson for this guy. He was not happy. He didn't get his funding for the next year. But he also didn't listen to his local naturalist, which you really need to do. That's my that's my theory.
Great. We've also got a lot of kind of talk going on in the comments about ways that you can get involved volunteering with New York City parks to do things like invasive removal, native planting. So definitely suggest you check that out if you're interested in getting involved. And I'm sure, outside of New York City parks, that wherever you are, there's probably similar sorts of things going on. I know some people, even just in general, when they're out, if to have a pair of clippers sometimes just with you, that if you come across plants being inundated by invasive vines, that you can sometimes give a little snip and help them out like that.
Okay, so I'm going to speak to that for a moment. So that can be good in some ways. Number one, you need to know what you're looking at and make sure you're identifying it correctly, because I have seen people tearing out native sumac and swearing to me that it's ailanthus. And I know it seems trite, but we cannot afford to lose another native plant by a well-meaning person. So just make sure you're with someone, or you yourself know what you're cutting, because that's important. The other thing is, and it seems counterintuitive, but the cutting of vines may work in some cases, but it does not work well for Oriental bittersweet. It actually makes it worse. And I have firsthand experience with that. So if you're cutting Oriental bittersweet, you're going to do it in the fall, not in the spring, and you're going to have to treat it with something. And so I really discourage people from just cutting back Oriental bittersweet, because it comes back threefold. And I've had experience years ago with that, and I stopped that technique very quickly. So that's anecdotal information, but it's been proven in studies. And so I'm gonna, unless you've got someone that has the authority to use herbicides, we had someone on board that could paint the stump with a certain herbicide. It wasn't me, but somebody else. And so I'm gonna just caution cutting Oriental bittersweet, because it may get worse. Sorry for that.
Oh no, that's great. So let me revise my statement. I think it would be probably best to get involved with some kind of group that's doing these kind of removals, so that they can kind of do the best practices.
I think so. Yeah, I really do. I've seen both, and thanks.
Right, because we want to keep, right. We hate to remove some kind of, a native plant that's finally, gotten its foothold.
Right.
Yeah. Really. Yeah. So also some questions, some kind of comments in here about interest in local field trips. And so I will say, as Nancy mentioned, the Torrey Botanical Society is one such group that runs field trips in the city, and those will be resuming again in the spring. There are also some other groups that aren't necessarily plant groups, but that will do botany walks. So for example, the Linnean Society, I'm blanking on some other, but there are, some other kind of more naturalist groups that will do botany specific walks. If you do usually a Google search or things like that, you're find some really cool events. Newtown Creek Alliance is also mentioned that they do some trips. So there's lots of ways to be able to get out to test out some of these new skills that we might have learned today, or to kind of continue to just go out to see what you can find in all the different seasons. And if you are in New York City, then if you download the app, the iNaturalist app, or even just take photos that you upload later, you can add them to the New York City EcoFlora project, which is great to kind of be able to track these different species and see where they are and how things are going. All right. So if anybody has any last minute questions, you can feel free to pop them in the chat. But otherwise, I would say thanks so much. Thank you, Nancy, for coming and speaking with us.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And thanks everybody for your comments. This presentation will be available on the YouTube page soon, and stay tuned for an announcement on our next month's talk. So everybody stay warm, stay well, and we'll see you soon.